What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Okay, now, we know with everything that's been going on in Texas, we've been talking about for the past couple of days, now we've got all these other states talking about doing some redistricting and gerrymandering, if you will, when, you know what, at this point, it's probably almost nigh on impossible to gerrymander any further for Democrats to squeeze any more Democratic districts out of the states, out of any of these lines, right? They've been gerrymandered into oblivion at this point, and there's not much more gerrymandering that you can do. They've gerrymandered so much that they've had to install independent committees to actually redraw lines. That's how bad it's getting, folks. That is how bad the gerrymandering has become in this country. And right, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Because I know I talk about it all the time. Like, why do some of these districts, like you'll have almost a square block here, and they'll just have this one little jut out that comes down. Well, you know, part of that reason, not necessarily that one little jut out that I was talking about the other day, but partially the reason they look weird is because they need to have an exact number of people within that district. And people don't live in square blocks, for crying out loud. But like I said, these districts should be as square as possible. You should not have, like this in Illinois, right here. Look at this. It is an odd curved shape that just goes all the way across the map like this. Like, hang on, let's look into this a little bit. Why is it shaped like that when you have all this area where you could just draw a square block or a circle or a triangle or something different? Why that curved shape like that? Well, that just so happens to connect two blue cities, two Democrat cities. So all those people in between, yeah, none of those people actually get representation. They don't get represented by a congressman that identifies with them politically. This is fascinating, y'all. But we've got a remedy for this, folks. We have got a major remedy for this. Check this out. Trump says census will no longer count undocumented immigrants. Well, you know what? That's not necessarily true, because Donald Trump did not mention anything about undocumented immigrants. He mentioned criminal aliens. That's what he said. Not undocumented immigrants. Because undocumented immigrants is not the same thing. Right? They're totally different, folks. Now, sure, undocumented immigrants, they don't need to be counted because they're about to be booted out of this country. Because they failed to renew their visa or whatever it was that was keeping them in the country legally. They failed to do that. So, therefore, they no longer want to be in this country. That's how I view this. Anybody that would allow their visa or green card or whatever it may be to expire, that allows for that, they don't want to be here anymore. And if they overstay a visa, they're breaking the law intentionally, on purpose. We don't want to count the criminal aliens at all. And we do, folks. Because criminal aliens, they come into this country and they'll rent a house, and then, you know, every decade they'll get a packet, because every household gets a packet from the census, and they could fill that census out. And that is where your representation derives from. Now, this article is quite fascinating because it goes into a pretty good breakdown of what the census does and how congressional power is derived from that census. So let's get into this. Now, transparency warning right quick. I did kind of eliminate a little bit of fluff from the article where they were just ranting about Donald Trump, blah, 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 blah. I didn't really care about that. This isn't some, you know, rant about the left-wing news video. I kind of wanted to get into this, just the news itself. So let's get into it. I just wanted to throw that transparency alert out there, if you will. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution establishes how representatives are allocated for the U.S. House and calls for a census every 10 years to determine the population of each state. Non-citizens have never been excluded from the count, whether they are legal residents or not. In his first term, Trump tried to add a question about citizenship to the census with the goal of ultimately excluding undocumented immigrants from the count, deciding how many representatives each state gets, but the Supreme Court blocked the move, right? Like, it makes abso-freaking-lutely no sense. Why do people that don't belong here, that broke our laws to come into this country, why do they deserve representation? They're not supposed to be in the country. Under that sort of logic, that means we need to have districts in Columbia. I know we have a District of Columbia, but I'm talking about the country Columbia. Because what if those people want to be part of the United States? They just so happen to have not broken our laws to come into the country illegally. That's the same logic. Because the only difference between, I don't know, an Argentinian national and an Argentinian national that's in the United States is one of those nationals broke our laws. Which would you have represented in Congress? I'm just saying. These people that break into our country to come in to exploit our good nature do not deserve any sort of representation at all. Right? I mean, do you think, seriously, a serious question for everybody, do you think that people that come here on vacation deserve representation in Congress? No, right? No, because that's an absurd notion to think, well, they're just here on vacation. So is somebody that broke into our country illegally. They are not here to contribute to society, folks. They don't pay taxes. They don't get Social Security. Sure, they may work, but once again, they're not paying taxes. Why should they get representation? It's a very, very good question. Donald Trump says no, screw this. Because we do count criminal aliens on the census, California gets overrepresented because they have an overrepresentation of illegal immigrants or criminal aliens within their state. So they get overrepresented in Congress. That is why, folks, California has anywhere from 3 to 7 extra congressional seats that they should not have. They also have that exact amount of electoral college votes that they should not have. That is right, folks. Regardless if criminal aliens vote in elections, they still get represented by electoral college votes. So that means, in other words, that every person that votes in California has just a little bit more than one vote, because their vote counts for any criminal alien. Like you would have to take up and average everything out, right? So it'd be like, you know, each person would have 1.0001% of the vote instead of just exactly one vote or whatever it is. You know, they have 1.001 votes. That's unfair to everybody else in the country. That's what that means. That's why so many conservatives rail against counting criminal aliens in the census, because once again, like I said, that means any state that is overrepresented by anybody that is here illegally, they get more of a say than everybody else. That's very, very unfair, if you ask me. The attempt was slammed by critics who said it would lead to underrepresentation for certain states and discourage people from participating in the census. Well, how about in the inverse, right? This is an outright admittance right here that, oh, that would mean underrepresentation. So counting these criminal aliens naturally means, the logical conclusion to that would mean that any state that has more criminal aliens than any other state, their citizenry gets overrepresented. The critics just debunked themselves. I love the Democrat logic argument because they're not really arguments, they're more like fallacies. Researchers found that non-citizens who pay taxes but are ineligible to have a Social Security number would be less likely to fill out the census questionnaire, exacerbating undercounts of some groups. After the Supreme Court ruling, Trump instead issued a memorandum demanding illegal aliens be excluded from apportionment and put on an executive order telling government agencies to produce administrative records to determine the number of non-citizens. But President Joe Biden revoked both of those decisions before the 2020 census data was released. Yeah, good job, Joe. Yeah, now you're disenfranchising possibly millions of voters. That's what that does, y'all. That is exactly what that does. It disenfranchises any state that is underrepresented by criminal aliens. What information does the census gather? The census gathers demographic data on people's age, sex, race, ethnicity, marital status, and household composition. It also asks about employment status, occupation, and level of education, and about housing units, occupancy status, number of rooms and rent prices. Questions on birth, place of residence, and migration patterns help track population movement. What is the census used for? Here we go. Lots of things. Most notably, it finds how many people live in each state, and that number is used to determine how many representatives each state gets in the U.S. House. The results are also sent to state legislatures and redistricting commissions to adjust or redraw electoral districts based on where populations have shifted. Billions of dollars in federal funding is allocated based on the results of the census, including through programs like Medicaid, Head Start, and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. The data also informs decisions on whether to build hospitals and schools and how to allocate public safety services like those provided by police and fire departments. The census is used by private business owners looking to make decisions based on where to open new storefronts, where to recruit employees, and what services to offer. What would change if undocumented immigrants were no longer counted? How many representatives each state has? The Pew Research Center used government records to analyze what states would be impacted back when Trump first floated this idea and found California, Florida, and Texas would each have one less seat than they would have been awarded based on population change alone. Alabama, Minnesota, and Ohio would each have held on to a seat they otherwise would have lost. Once again, folks, I don't buy that, because I've seen other studies that show that California just alone is anywhere from 3 to 7 extra congressional seats, right? This is just common logic, right? Texas would be involved in this too. So once again, folks, this isn't some, Donald Trump just wants to make sure we gain more power. No, because Texas would be heavily impacted by this. Florida would be heavily impacted by this. But also, think about it, folks. Where do the criminal aliens go to? They go to blue states, naturally, because that's where Democrats want them to go. Now, Texas just so happens to be a place where criminal aliens, they come across that border. Arizona and New Mexico as well, but not as much New Mexico, even though that's a blue state. But, that area along the border, it's a lot of desert. And they just don't cross a lot through New Mexico. But Arizona's a hotbed, California's a hotbed, and Texas is a hotbed for sure. So all of those states would definitely be affected. But then you've got, your upper Midwest and New England, because of New York, and a lot of criminal aliens, they go up there because they're criminal alien friendly or whatever, so they can go and reside in those states and feel free, much more free than they would in, somewhere like Louisiana, for crying out loud, where we really don't like criminal aliens all that much in this state. They don't like them in Texas either, but there's not much you can do about it in Texas because they are a border state. And it was real bad under the Biden administration. But, there's a lot of states that would be impacted. But if you go through and you don't count all the criminal aliens, I can promise you, reluctantly, I would say, funny, that blue states are going to be more impacted by this than red states. Just saying, just on an overall basis. It's unfortunate, but that would level the playing field, essentially, because right now the playing field is very, very out of balance, if you will, because of the criminal aliens that get counted on the census. Now Donald Trump isn't talking about not counting legal permanent residents, right? Immigrants that are not citizens. Those people still get counted. Just the criminal aliens would not get counted anymore. What to watch for? Lawsuits, of course. Trump's first attempt to change how immigrants were counted was swiftly met with court action, including from the American Civil Liberties Union and several immigrants' rights groups. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the Trump administration, I guess, that they forgot to put that in there, I assume, couldn't add the citizenship question largely on procedural grounds. So they didn't agree with it politically or ideologically, if you will. So they didn't even ask that question. It was just the procedure that the Trump administration went about doing so. They found problems with it. So maybe if they do it right this time, they could get that across the line. But the thing is, we not only need an executive order from Trump, but Congress must codify that executive order. That gives so much more weight. Because Congress, they say we have co-equal branches here. But it's not, folks. It's absolutely not. Congress is the most powerful branch in our government, to be honest with you, right? For the most part. Like, this is just speaking theoretically, essentially. Congress should have the most power because they hold the purse strings. They are the legislators. They are the ones that say what goes. Now, the second most powerful would be Article 3, the judicial branch, because they are the ones that litigate all of these things, all the legislation, anything that Article 2 does, that is the least powerful. Now, in terms of possibilities, I guess you could say, Article 2 could be the most powerful because that is the enforcement arm. They could just say, screw the courts, screw Congress, we are going to do what we want. That is where you get authoritarianism. When the administration says, we don't care what the law says, we don't care what the courts say, we're going to do what we want, then you have authoritarianism, folks. And then they actually violate our Constitution and violate our rights, if you will. Right? Rights, I don't know. I saw this debate the other day, and I'm convinced at this point that rights are just a social construct, that we just make them up. And who is to say? The only enforcement arm is willingness from people with guns, as a matter of fact, that are willing to uphold that social construct and enforce those rights. If those people didn't exist, your rights would quickly just poof, disappear, folks. That's right. It's because of a person with a gun. You have rights. That is why. That is why the Second Amendment is so important. That's exactly why the Second Amendment is so important. Because if you have a gun, you can defend your rights, as a matter of fact. But I think I've rambled on for long enough. Y'all let me know what y'all think about all this down in the comments section. Love to hear from you guys. Don't forget to smash that like button for me. Subscribe if you're new around here. Share this video all over the place with everybody you know and anywhere you can. I know I had to flip that around, kind of.
Using magic to explain logical inconsistencies is tight. Yeah, it is.
And y'all sign up and become a member. That would be great, y'all. That would be lovely if y'all could do that. Yeah, but I think that's all I got. Y'all try to have a good day and stay legitical. Peace.